On June 20, 1942, 33 Marines of K Company faced 2,700 Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal. One sergeant held his ground for 10 hours. His stand became legendary. How could so few resist such overwhelming numbers? This is the story of duty and honor under impossible odds. In August 1942, Sergeant Henry's squad landed on Guadalcanal, a thin strip of sand and palm trees in the Solomon Islands. The island was thousands of miles from home. Their mission was clear: hold the small ridge at all costs. The squad was young. Most were barely 19 years old. They were hungry, exhausted, and far from comfort. They had little time to prepare. Their orders were simple but deadly serious. The ridge was the key to controlling the island. Unknown to the Marines, thousands of Japanese soldiers had already landed nearby. The enemy's presence was a growing threat, but the squad had no exact idea how many or when they would attack. The jungle around them was dense and unforgiving. Thick vines and towering trees limited visibility and slowed movement. The heat and humidity sapped strength. Every step forward was a challenge. Sergeant Henry and his men set up defensive positions along the ridge. They knew the terrain better than the enemy, but the jungle could also hide danger. They had to stay alert and ready. The Marines understood what was coming. The signs were clear. The enemy was close and a fierce fight was inevitable. This was more than a battle for land. It was a test of will, faith, and survival under extreme conditions. Holding the ridge was not just about strategy. It was about honor. Each man carried the weight of responsibility, not only for himself but for his squad and the larger mission in the Pacific. This small group stood as the thin line between the enemy and the island's airfield. Losing the ridge could mean losing Guadalcanal and control of the Solomon Islands. The stage was set. Sergeant Henry's squad prepared to face an enemy they could neither see nor fully understand. Their duty was clear, but the cost would be high. This was Guadalcanal in 1942, a remote jungle battle that would become a turning point in the Pacific War. On the morning of February 19, 1945, Sergeant Henry stood before his men along the sandbag line at the edge of the beachhead on Iwo Jima. Darkness lingered just before dawn. The air hung heavy and still, with no breeze to break the thick humidity. Sweat trickled down the faces of the Marines as Henry methodically checked their rifles. Each man returned not a silent confirmation of readiness. The unit prepared for the day's critical defense. Nearby, a radio crackled with static, sending bursts of fragmented reports across the lines. The tension was palpable but controlled. The men knew what lay ahead. Japanese forces were entrenched in the high ridges overlooking the landing sites. The Marines had orders to hold this ground at all costs. Suddenly, from the shadowed tree line, subtle sounds broke the silence. Branches snapped underfoot. The faint shuffling of feet approached closer. Henry tightened his grip on his rifle. The men shifted to ready positions, scanning the dark perimeter. Seconds later, the night sky erupted with the sharp flash of flares. Burning white light spilled across the ridge, exposing the enemy's movement. The silhouetted forms of Japanese soldiers surged forward, their bayonets catching the flare's glare. The charge was swift and brutal. "Hold steady, fire," Henry barked. The Marines opened up into the advancing enemy with disciplined volleys. Bullets tore through the humid air, punctuated by the sharp reports of rifle fire. Visibility shrank to bursts of muzzle flashes and echoes of shouted commands. The world narrowed to the immediate fight. Marines firing, enemy charging, the thud of feet against earth, the clash of bayonet on rifle. The air filled with the raw sounds of close combat. Henry moved along the line, shouting orders to adjust fire and hold positions. The enemy pressed hard, but the Marines' steady discipline slowed the charge. Each man knew a single misstep could mean death. This first attack was just the beginning. The Japanese aimed to retake the ridge and break the beachhead. The Marines' mission was clear: hold the line and prevent any breakthrough. In combat, 6 seconds meant death. The quick flare revealed the enemy's approach. The rapid Marine response stopped the charge before it could reach the sandbags. Discipline and training turned the tide in those critical moments. By dawn, the ridge fell silent again, except for the low moans of wounded. The Marines held their ground. Sergeant Henry's men counted the cost. Several casualties, but the line remained intact. This small battle set the tone for the brutal days ahead on Iwo Jima. The Japanese would not relent. The Marines knew each attack tested their courage and resolve. The fight on this ridge illustrated a harsh truth. In this war, honor was measured by the ability to stand firm under fire. Sergeant Henry and his men embodied that duty, holding the line against overwhelming odds. The air was still thick with sweat and smoke as the sun rose. The battle was far from over, but for now, the Marines had held their ground. Their discipline and resolve had turned the enemy's charge into a costly failure. This first clash was a testament to the harsh reality of Pacific Island warfare, a relentless, brutal fight where every second and every shot counted. Sergeant Henry's leadership kept his men alive. Their honor lay in their stand. As day broke over Iwo Jima, the memory of this dawn attack would linger. It was a moment where duty and courage met in the harsh light of battle. The Marines' defense here would become part of the story remembered long after the guns fell silent. Within minutes, the Japanese attackers reached the wire. They moved fast and low, using grenades to clear the defenses. Explosions shook the ground. Dirt and bodies flew into the air. Private Miller crouched behind his rifle, frozen and trembling. His hands shook as he gripped the stock. Nearby, Corporal Henry shouted sharply, dragging Miller up by the shoulder. "Keep shooting," he commanded. The urgency in Henry's voice cut through the chaos. The Marines returned fire, their rifles barking rapidly. The line wavered but did not break. Men fell, but the defenders forced the enemy back. Blood mixed with sweat on their faces and hands. The first Japanese assault ended with the ground covered in fallen attackers and defenders alike. The air was thick with dust and smoke. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung heavy. In the brief lull, the Marines worked quickly to reload. Their hands were shaking, but their training took over. No one spoke. Silence fell between the bursts of gunfire. Private Miller wiped the sweat from his brow, still trembling but holding his rifle ready. Corporal Henry scanned the darkened field ahead, watching for signs of another attack. The tension was intense. Every second could bring another wave. This first assault tested the Marines' resolve. They had to hold the line despite exhaustion and fear. Their weapons and nerves were pushed to the limit. The wire had stopped the enemy short, but the fight was far from over. The defenders knew their position was critical. If the line broke here, the Japanese could pour through and overrun the base. The stakes were clear. Each man understood his role, hold at all costs. Grenades had been the enemy's main weapon to breach the wire. The explosions disoriented the Marines, but did not collapse their defense. Small arms fire kept the attackers pinned back once they crossed the initial obstacle. The Marines' ability to maintain fire despite close-range combat made the difference. They used steady bursts, aiming for enemy officers and machine gunners first. This disrupted the assault's momentum and prevented total collapse. Henry's command to keep shooting was as much about morale as tactics. If the men stopped firing, panic could spread. The line depended on continuous pressure to survive. In combat, hesitation could mean death. Miller's initial freeze was dangerous, but Henry's quick action pulled him back into the fight. The difference between shooting and freezing was the difference between life and death. The ground was littered not only with bodies, but with spent shells and broken gear. The Marines' faces showed fatigue, but also determination. Blood and sweat were indistinguishable stains on their uniforms. The lull allowed both sides to catch their breath, but it was a brief respite. The Marines knew the enemy would regroup and attack again. Their hands shook as they reloaded, but their eyes stayed sharp. No one spoke during this pause. Talking could waste breath or break concentration. Silence was a shared understanding. The fight was not over. The first assault had ended, but the battle for this position was only beginning. The Marines' ability to hold the wire under such pressure would shape the fate of the entire defense. This moment showed the brutal reality of close combat. Grenades and small arms combined to create chaos. Yet discipline and training kept the defenders united. The Marines' line had not broken. That was the key outcome. Blood and sweat bought time and space. They held the ground despite the enemy's violent push. In the silence after the assault, each man processed what had just happened. Fear was there, but so was a fierce sense of duty. They knew they had to stand firm. The wire was more than a physical barrier. It was a test of will. The first Japanese attack had failed to breach it. That failure was a critical victory for the defenders. The Marines' success came down to one simple principle: never stop firing. Every bullet counted. Every second of resistance mattered. This was combat in its rawest form. Close, chaotic, deadly. The men fought not for glory, but to protect their comrades and their position. Private Miller's trembling hands were still steadying. Corporal Henry remained alert, ready to lead the next defense. Together, they embodied the resilience needed to survive. The first attack showed the cost of battle. The wounded and dead lay scattered, silent witnesses to the violence. The survivors prepared for more. This was the harsh truth of war: hold the line or lose everything. The Marines understood that clearly. For now, the line stood firm. The enemy had been pushed back. But the fight was far from over. The first assault tested every man's resolve. It taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. In those minutes of chaos and silence, the Marines learned what it meant to stand resolute. Blood mixed with sweat. The line held. The battle continued. At sunrise, the second wave of Japanese attackers arrived. Mortars pounded the ridge with heavy, relentless fire. Each shell exploded nearby, sending sand, dirt, and wooden splinters flying in all directions. The air filled with sharp cracks and thuds. Visibility dropped as dust kicked up. The ridge shook with each impact. The defenders knew this was the moment to hold or be overrun. Corporal Vasquez moved quickly across the rough ground. A fellow soldier lay wounded, his leg bleeding heavily. Vasquez crawled over the uneven earth, careful to stay low beneath the mortar bursts. He pressed a bandage tight against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. His hands worked fast but steady. The enemy was closing in, their voices growing louder. There was no time for hesitation. The Japanese attackers came forward in waves, faces painted in traditional patterns. They shouted battle cries, voices sharp and fierce. Their bayonets glinted in the rising sun. Henry's voice rose above the chaos. He barked orders with hoarse urgency, rallying his men. His throat was dry, his tone firm but strained. The pressure of command weighed heavily on him. Miller, standing at the edge of the trench line, finally fired his rifle. His face was blank, almost stunned. The shock of combat had overtaken him. His trigger finger moved mechanically, firing round after round. The squad's world condensed into a blur of smoke, heat, and noise. Mortar explosions, rifle fire, and shouted commands filled every second. Time seemed to stretch and contract with each blast. Every man fought not just the enemy, but the overwhelming chaos. The ridge became a battlefield of confusion and fear, but also resolve. They knew retreat was impossible. Sand filled their mouths and nostrils. Sweat ran down their faces, mixing with dirt and grime. The heat of explosions warmed the cold dawn. The soldiers' senses sharpened, focused entirely on survival. Corporal Vasquez glanced up from the wounded man. Japanese soldiers were only a few yards away, closing fast. He tightened the bandage one last time. There was no room for weakness. Henry moved along the line, shouting clear commands. "Hold your ground, don't fall back." The men responded as best they could. Every moment counted. Miller's rifle cracked repeatedly, sending bullets into the attacking force. His eyes were wide but focused. The blank shock began to fade, replaced by grim determination. The attackers reached the trench, throwing grenades and firing at close range. The defenders responded with steady fire, pushing back fiercely. The ridge shook under the assault. In combat, hesitation meant death. Every second delayed risked losing the position. The mortar fire had softened the defenders, but their will held strong. The Japanese shouted and charged, but the defenders' fire slowed them. Each man fought with duty driving him. Honor demanded they hold, no matter the cost. Smoke swirled thick around the ridge. The sun rose higher, but visibility stayed. Dust and smoke mixed, blurring lines between friend and foe. The men's breathing was heavy but controlled. They fired in bursts, conserving ammunition where possible. Every shot counted. Corporal Vasquez stayed with the wounded man, refusing to leave. He helped him stay conscious between bursts of enemy fire. His actions kept hope alive amid destruction. Henry's voice cracked as he issued more orders. "Cover the left flank, watch your sectors." The squad shifted, adapting to the enemy's moves. Miller's rifle emptied. He quickly reloaded, hands steady despite exhaustion. The fight was far from over. The second wave of attackers pushed hard, but the defenders refused to yield. Their discipline and training showed under fire. The ridge held. The mortars had pounded relentlessly, but the defenders' determination held firm. The attackers' momentum slowed. For the squad, the battle was a test of endurance. The noise, heat, and fear pressed in, but their sense of duty didn't falter. In the chaos, every action mattered. A bandage here, a command there, a bullet fired just in time. The ridge was their line in the sand. The fighting continued with brutal intensity. The defenders knew the ridge was vital. Losing it meant allowing the enemy closer to their base. By sunrise, the second wave had been pushed back. The ridge was battered but still defended. The cost was high, several wounded, some shaken, but the position held. The fight had shown the squad's resolve and honor. They stood together in the face of overwhelming attack. The battle was far from over, but this morning brought a clear message. The ridge would not fall without a fight. The memory of the mortar fire, the shouted orders, and the frantic aid to the wounded would stay with them. It was a moment of duty fulfilled under fire. The ridge was scarred, but the defenders' spirit remained unbroken. Their actions that morning saved lives and bought time. In combat, courage was measured in small acts. Vasquez's bandage, Henry's commands, Miller's fire. Together, they held the line. The battle paused. In the quiet between attacks, the squad gathered to count heads. Out of 12 men, 3 were missing. 2 more lay badly wounded, their faces pale from blood loss. Henry scanned the group. He saw fear in their eyes and exhaustion etched on every face. He reached into his pack and handed out water bottles. The cold liquid was scarce but necessary. One by one, the men took sips, trying to steady shaking hands. Henry moved through the line, stopping beside Vasquez. He clapped the younger Marine on the shoulder with a firm grip. "Keep your head," Henry said quietly. "We're not done yet." Above them, shells continued to whistle, cutting through the air like deadly warnings. The noise never fully stopped, but for now the ground assault had fallen silent. The men sat or lay low, muscles tense and ready to move. In the stillness, one Marine folded his hands and closed his eyes. He prayed. No words reached the others. Only the distant thud of explosions and the low moan of the wind. The prayer was a private moment, a small anchor in the chaos. Farther across the ridge, the enemy forces gathered. They were pulling back, reforming their lines after the failed push. The Marines could see movement, figures slipping between rocks and trees. The hillside was littered with debris-spent shells, broken branches, and the marks of recent fire. The smell around the squad was thick with cordite and earth. The sharp tang of gunpowder mixed with the dust of disturbed soil. It filled the nostrils and clung to clothes and skin. This was the smell of battle, raw and unyielding. Henry looked at each man, knowing what lay ahead. They were worn down but still alive. The missing would not return until the fight ended. The wounded needed care that could not come here. Every man counted, every breath taken was a small victory. The lull was temporary. The enemy would strike again. The squad had minutes to rest, to prepare. Henry's eyes never left the ridge, watching for any sign of movement. The ridge was their front line, their barrier against the next wave. In moments like these, the battle was not just about guns or tactics. It was about endurance, about holding on when everything hurt, about honor in the face of fear. The men understood this without words. Silence settled, broken only by the distant crack of rifles and the rustle of leaves. The Marine who had prayed opened his eyes slowly. He looked to Henry and nodded, as if sharing a silent promise. They would keep fighting. They would hold the line. The squad adjusted their gear quietly. Weapons were checked, ammunition counted. Each man prepared for the next attack with steady hands, pushing down exhaustion and fear. The memory of lost comrades was sharp, a constant reminder of the stakes. Henry took one last glance around. 3 missing, 2 wounded, 7 ready. The fight was far from over, but in this moment they survived. That was the first step toward victory. The lull ended as suddenly as it began. A new wave of enemy soldiers appeared over the ridge. The men rose, weapons ready. Henry shouted orders. The battle reignited with a roar. The squad moved forward with purpose. They knew what they faced. They had seen what fear and exhaustion looked like, and they fought on anyway. The fight was brutal, but the Marines held their ground. In war, moments of quiet were rare and precious. They offered time to count heads, to sip water, to pray. But they also reminded every man what was at risk. The ridge was their line. They would not let it fall. And so, in the midst of smoke and cordite, the Marines prepared for what came next. Duty demanded no less. Honor required no less. The memory of this fight would stay with them long after the last shell exploded. At midday, the Japanese launched their third assault. This time, they advanced low to the ground. They used the bodies of their dead as cover, inching forward behind fallen comrades. The Marines waited. They fired point-blank into the enemy. The close range left no room for error. Every shot counted. Miller gripped his rifle tightly. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. Suddenly, his rifle jammed. The weapon locked up just as the enemy closed in. He fumbled desperately to clear the jam. His fingers, slick with sweat, struggled with the mechanism. Time ran out fast under enemy fire. Vasquez saw the danger. He yanked Miller down behind cover just as bullets snapped overhead. The crack of gunfire was relentless and close. Miller gasped for breath. His heart pounded. Without a working rifle, he was exposed. The risk was clear. 1 second without defense could mean death. Meanwhile, Henry crawled toward a broken radio nearby. The radio was their only chance to call for help. He dragged himself over rough ground, avoiding enemy fire. Dirt and blood covered his uniform. Every movement was slow and painful. Reaching the radio, Henry lifted the receiver and called out. Only static answered. No friendly voice came back. The radio was dead. No help was on the way. The Marines faced the enemy alone. The Japanese pressed forward, relentless and low to the ground. The battlefield had closed to less than 50 yards. In close combat like this, rifles jammed, radios failed, and survival depended on quick reactions. Miller's jammed rifle showed how even small mechanical failures could cost lives. The Marines fired from behind whatever cover they could find. The bodies of their dead had become both shield and warning. In combat, 6 seconds meant death. The Japanese tactic of crawling behind bodies reduced their exposure. It forced the Marines to fire constantly at targets barely visible. But firing at that range risked wasting ammunition or hitting comrades. The tension was physical and precise. Vasquez's quick action to pull Miller down saved his life. In seconds, he recognized the jam and acted. Henry's attempt to call for help failed because the radio was damaged. Communication breakdowns were common in fierce battles like this. Without radio contact, the Marines had no way to request reinforcements or air support. The ground fight had turned into a brutal, slow crawl. Every inch gained or lost was soaked in blood. The Marines' position was precarious. Their small front line was vulnerable to being overrun. Yet they held. Their discipline and training kept them fighting despite exhaustion and failing equipment. This scene showed the brutal reality of close combat in jungle warfare. Technology failures and enemy tactics forced raw courage and quick thinking. The Japanese used their dead as moving cover. This was a grim but effective tactic. The Marines responded with point-blank fire, risking friendly fire and wasting ammo. They had no choice. Miller's jammed rifle represented the limits of individual soldiers against relentless assaults. The broken radio symbolized isolation on the battlefield. In this moment, survival depended on teamwork and sheer will. The midday assault tested the Marines' endurance. It exposed the fragility of their supply lines and communication. Yet they adapted. Vasquez's quick reflexes and Henry's attempt at radio contact showed their determination. The battle moved forward, slow and brutal, driven by close quarters, failing gear and determination. This assault was the harshest yet. But the Marines refused to yield. Their defense slowed the Japanese advance. It bought time for others to regroup and counterattack. For the Marines, every second counted. Every shot fired at point-blank range was a fight for life. The jammed rifle and silent radio were obstacles they had to overcome. This was war stripped to its rawest elements: men, weapons, and will. The midday assault ended with the Marines still holding their ground. But the cost was high. Their honor lay in their refusal to break, even when isolated and outgunned. This moment captured the brutal reality of Pacific combat: close, chaotic, and unforgiving. The Marines' duty was clear. They held their line. They fought with honor. Their memory would become part of the story of perseverance under fire. Hours passed under a relentless sun. The Marines held their ground, but their strength was fading. Ammunition was nearly gone. Each bullet fired had counted, but now the clips clicked empty. The heat pressed down, sapping energy and dulling senses. Water was the new treasure. The men shared the small amounts left in canteens, careful not to waste a single drop. Their lips cracked and tongues thickened. Wounded soldiers lay quietly, their breathing shallow. Some groaned softly, pain becoming a constant companion. Henry moved among the wounded. His hands were steady but gentle. When a Marine's breath faltered, Henry gave his last dose of morphine. The needle was empty afterward. There was nothing more he could do to ease the suffering. He caught Miller's eye across the dusty ground. Both understood the grim truth. They hoped for relief, but none came yet. The enemy was not finished. The distant sound of voices grew clearer. Japanese officers gathered, preparing for another attack. The Marines were running on will alone. Each man knew the next moments could decide everything. The line between holding and breaking was razor-thin. Every muscle ached. Every man faced the same harsh question: how long could they last? The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying. Shadows shrank. Water evaporation stole moisture from the thirst became unbearable, but survival demanded patience. The men exchanged quiet words, sharing what little they had. Honor held them firm. Henry looked again toward the enemy lines. The officers' figures moved with purpose. Their presence meant an organized push was imminent. The Marines braced themselves, knowing their firepower was almost spent. Hope for reinforcements flickered, but was uncertain. In battle, every second counted. The men counted on one another. They had no choice but to hold fast. Their position was critical. Losing ground could mean disaster for the larger mission. The wounded were a constant reminder of the cost. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he tended the last of his patients. The pain in the air was thick, but so was the resolve. The Marines fought not just for survival, but for each other. Miller approached Henry briefly. No words were needed. A nod passed between them, silent but full of meaning. They faced the same stark reality. The next enemy wave would test their limits. The Japanese officers ordered their men forward. The sound of movement grew louder. The Marines' weapons were nearly empty. Their courage was full. Every man prepared to meet the attack. This moment was a test of endurance and honor. Each breath carried the weight of duty. Each shared sip of water was a bond. The sun bore down as the inevitable clash approached. The Marines had come far. Their numbers dwindled, but their spirit remained intact. They stood as a single unit, bound by experience and necessity. The battlefield was a harsh teacher, but it forged loyalty as strong as steel. In the face of exhaustion and pain, they held their ground. The knowledge that help might not come did not break them. Instead, it strengthened their determination. This was war's harsh reality. No guarantees, only choices. The Marines chose to stand. They chose to fight. The officers on the other side readied their men for the assault. The final moments before battle stretched long and heavy. Time slowed as both sides prepared to collide again. Henry caught Miller's eye once more. That look said everything. They were tired. They were hurt. But they were not defeated. The sun continued its march across the sky. The Marines waited, water nearly gone, ammunition spent, honor their last defense. The next wave was coming. The fight was far from over. Near dusk on November 20, 1943, the final assault on Peleliu's northern ridge began. The jungle exploded with noise. Dozens of voices shouted orders and cries. Gunfire cracked through thick undergrowth. Grenades detonated in rapid succession, sending dirt and leaves flying. The Marines advanced from crater to crater. Each shell hole offered brief cover. They pressed their backs against one another, forming tight groups to cover all sides. The dense jungle made visibility poor. The enemy was close. Every movement risked a burst of fire. Sergeant Vasquez was hit early in the assault. A bullet tore into his shoulder. Despite the pain, he kept firing his M1 rifle. He crouched low but refused to fall back. His determination rallied the men around him. His squad pressed forward, inch by inch. Corporal Henry's voice was nearly gone. Hours of shouting orders and encouragement had worn him down. His throat was raw, his words hoarse. Still, he urged his men on, telling them to hold the line, to push through the enemy's defenses. His presence was a steadying force amid chaos. The Japanese defenders pushed hard in return. They reached the barbed wire that marked the Marines' forward edge. The wire was tangled and sharp, but it did not stop them. Hand-to-hand combat erupted instantly beyond the fence. The two sides fought desperately for every inch. Private Miller engaged in brutal close combat. His bayonet flashed in the fading light. He stabbed at enemy soldiers trying to break through. His face was streaked with tears, mixed with sweat and grime. The fight was personal and savage. It was survival. The jungle around them was a maze of shadows and noise. Every sound was amplified in the night. The Marines could hear the grunts and gasps of the enemy nearby. Grenades exploded so close that dirt and shrapnel hit their helmets. The air smelled of smoke and gunpowder. Each crater became a small battlefield of its own. The men fought over these shell holes as if they were forts. They used them to reload, breathe, and fire again. The Japanese launched counterattacks from the jungle, trying to push the Marines back. But the Marines held firm. The fighting was relentless. Every few minutes, another Marine fell. Others dragged wounded comrades to safety. Vasquez, though wounded, continued to cover the squad's flank. His fire kept enemy soldiers pinned down. Without him, the line might have broken. Henry's voice cracked as he called for reinforcements and ammunition. Communication was difficult but essential. Supply lines had to stay open. Without fresh ammo, the Marines could not hold their ground. The men knew the importance of every shot fired. The hand-to-hand fighting was brutal. Bayonets, knives, fists, and rifle butts were weapons of choice. The dense jungle limited movement. There was no room for maneuvering. Close quarters favored those who fought with determination and desperation. Miller's tears were a rare sign of the battle's toll. The men were exhausted, scared, and angry. They fought for honor and survival. Each Marine understood the stakes. They could not retreat. They could not fail. The final assault was a test of will. The Marines pushed through the jungle darkness toward their objective. The Japanese defenders fought fiercely, but could not hold the line. The Marines' steady advance broke the enemy's resistance. By the end of the day, the ridge was in Marine hands. The cost was high. Many were wounded or dead. But the objective was secured. The fighting had been brutal, close, and personal. The men had faced the enemy at close range and won. In this battle, every second mattered. The Marines learned that close combat required more than weapons. It demanded resolve. Vasquez's determination, Henry's leadership, and Miller's fierce fighting were key to success. The final assault on the ridge showed the harsh reality of jungle warfare. The terrain, the enemy's tenacity, and the darkness combined into a deadly challenge. But the Marines adapted. They held together, pushed forward, and completed their mission. This moment remained seared in memory. The fighting from crater to crater, the close quarters combat, and the cost paid by the men defined this battle. It was a fight for honor in the darkest hours of the day. The ridge was theirs, but only after a fierce, unforgiving struggle. Suddenly, the attack stopped. The jungle fell silent. Only the moans of wounded men broke the quiet. The air hung heavy with dust and sweat. The 33 Marines lay flat on the ground. They were breathing hard. Their rifles were close at hand. Some had empty, staring eyes. Others barely moved. Henry crawled along the line, moving slowly. He checked each man for signs of life. Each one was a question mark in the dimming light. Only about a dozen answered his call. The rest were silent. Some were badly wounded. Others did not respond at all. The line was broken and ragged. The sun began to set behind the trees. The sky turned a deep, bloody red. The fading light painted the jungle in harsh shadows. Henry stopped beside a Marine clutching his rifle. The man's hands trembled. His eyes scanned the darkening forest. He was alive but shaken. The ground was littered with spent cartridges and broken branches. The smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat and dirt. The men's breaths came in ragged gasps. No one spoke. The silence was thick. It was a silence filled with exhaustion and loss. Henry looked around. The jungle no longer echoed with enemy fire. The threat seemed to have passed for now. But the cost was clear. Out of 33 men, only 12 remained responsive. The others were wounded or worse. Henry checked his watch. The fight had lasted for hours. The sun was setting fast. Night would bring new dangers. The men clung to their rifles as if the weight gave them strength. Their eyes were wide but empty, reflecting the brutal toll. They had fought hard. Each man had faced the enemy in a relentless struggle. Now they waited. They listened for any sign of the next attack. Henry knew survival now depended on rest and readiness. The jungle was quiet, but it was never safe. In war, silence often meant danger was near. The men stayed alert despite their fatigue. The setting sun was a clear signal. Darkness would soon cover the battlefield. Henry moved along the line once more. He checked the wounded again. Each man was a story of survival or sacrifice. The dozen who answered still held on to their duty. They were exhausted but alive. Henry understood their eyes told the same story. Fear and determination mixed in silent resolve. The sun disappeared behind the trees. The red sky faded to deep blue. Night was coming. The jungle held its breath as the day ended. The men prepared for what the darkness might bring. In this moment, Henry felt the weight of honor. The fight had been brutal. The cost was high, but the survivors still held their ground. They embodied duty. The silence was a brief pause. The war was not over. Henry knew this memory would stay with them. The names of the fallen would not be forgotten. The line was small now, but it was still fighting. The Marines waited, ready to face whatever came next. In combat, few survived untouched. The jungle had taken many. The dozen left would carry that memory forward. The sun set on a day marked by sacrifice. The Marines clung to their rifles and to life. As darkness settled, the line held firm. The fight for survival continued in the shadows. This was war, harsh, unforgiving, and unending. But in honor they stood. The silence spoke louder than guns. It told the story of duty fulfilled and lives forever changed. At dawn, fresh Marine reinforcements arrived on the battered battlefield. The air smelled of smoke and burnt earth. The ground was torn and blackened from the night's fighting. They found Henry's squad huddled together. The men were filthy, bloodied, and exhausted. Their faces showed raw fatigue, but also relief. They were alive. Around them, the remains of the enemy lay in heaps. Japanese soldiers were scattered across the field, motionless. Their bodies told the story of a fierce and brutal night. The reinforcements paused, taking in the scene. The silence was heavy. No cheers or shouts broke the quiet. The cost of survival was clear. Henry stood slowly, still shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. His uniform was stained and torn. He raised his hand in a stiff salute. The new Marines returned the salute, but no one spoke. The moment carried weight beyond words. Respect mixed with the grim reality of combat. There was no victory celebration. There was only the somber acknowledgement that the fight had been won, but at great cost. In battle, survival often meant losing much more than ammunition or men. It meant losing innocence. Henry and his squad had faced death and endured. The ground told the story better than words ever could. Craters and scorched earth marked every step. The blackened soil was a testament to the struggle. The enemy dead were many but not endless. Each body represented a failed attack, a life lost in desperate effort. The numbers showed the ferocity of the defense. Henry's men looked at the reinforcements with a mix of relief and weariness. They knew the fight wasn't over, but this moment was their proof of survival. The Marines' honor lay in their endurance. They held their ground against overwhelming odds. The silence of the dawn was a stark reminder of their duty. This moment would be remembered by all who saw it. The battlefield was a harsh classroom in sacrifice and resolve. Henry's squad had passed its test. No cheers were needed. The respect between soldiers was enough. Their unity and determination spoke louder than any celebration. Henry's shaky salute symbolized more than rank. It was a nod to every man who had fought and fallen. It honored the price paid in blood. The reinforcements stood quietly, taking in the scene. They understood the gravity of the night's battle. They prepared to join the fight, now hardened by what they saw. The memory of this dawn would stay with them. It was a moment when survival met sacrifice, when duty demanded everything, and honor carried them through. The battlefield was silent but spoke volumes. It bore witness to courage, loss, and the will to endure. Henry's squad was a living testament to that truth. In war, some victories come without fanfare. This was one of them. The Marines survived, but the cost was etched deeply into the earth and their souls. The new Marines moved forward, ready to take their place. The fight would continue, but for Henry's squad, this dawn marked a hard-earned moment of survival and honor. The battle was over. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the ground was littered with the remnants of war-broken gear, spent shells, and the bodies of fallen comrades. Survivors moved slowly among the wreckage. Vasquez found Miller sitting on a shattered crate, his face covered in grime and sweat. He extended a steady hand. Miller grasped it and pulled himself up. Both men were quiet, their eyes scanning the empty spaces where their friends had fought and died. Around them, others collected what they could. Dog tags lay tangled in the dirt. Letters, soaked and torn, were gathered carefully. Helmets, dented and bloodied, were picked up with reverence. These small pieces became the only physical connection to those lost. Henry sat a short distance away, apart from the group. His gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun was setting behind a line of distant trees. His posture was rigid, but his eyes held a faraway look. The long hours of combat weighed heavily on him. Each man was marked by what had happened. They carried the memories not just in their minds, but in their bodies, aches, bruises, and the numb fatigue of survival. The silence between them was filled with unspoken respect for what they had endured. The soldiers moved carefully, aware that any sudden action could break the fragile calm. No one spoke of victory or defeat. The cost was too high to celebrate. Loss hung in the air like a dense fog. Orders crackled over the radio. The unit was to move out, to regroup and prepare for the next phase of the campaign. But there was no rush. The men took their time. They knew that leaving so soon would feel like abandoning the fallen. Vasquez checked Miller's equipment one last time. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Miller nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. Both understood that the battle had changed them. They were no longer the same men who had taken off hours earlier. Henry finally rose, his eyes still heavy with thought. He walked slowly toward the others. The group formed a loose line, each man careful to support the others. Their steps were measured, deliberate. As they moved away from the battlefield, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the scarred earth. The quiet was broken only by the sound of boots on dirt and the occasional murmur of conversation. This moment would stay with them etched into memory. The names of those who fell, the hours of fight, the choices made under fire. They carried these with honor, a silent promise to remember. The war continued, but for now, the survivors honored their dead by moving forward together, changed but unbroken. The field behind them was still, but their duty was clear. In these final moments, the men understood one truth: the cost of battle was never forgotten. They carried it with them, a weight balanced by their commitment to each other and to the mission. The battle had ended, but the memory endured. The 10-hour defense by Sergeant Henry's squad on Guadalcanal remains a defining moment in the campaign. Their mission was clear: hold the ridge above the airfield at all costs. They succeeded, buying crucial time for Allied reinforcements to arrive. The cost was enormous. Nearly all of Henry's men were lost in the fight. Out of the original squad, only a handful survived the relentless Japanese attacks and the grueling terrain. Their bodies bore the scars of continuous combat, exhaustion, and scarce supplies. For the survivors, the battle did not end with the last shot fired. The memory of comrades lost stayed with them. Their courage was quiet, expressed not in medals or speeches, but in the weight of absence and the faces that never returned home. From a strategic viewpoint, holding the ridge secured the airfield. That airfield became a vital base for the Allies in the Solomon Islands, enabling air support and supply lines that shifted the balance in the Pacific. The defense delayed the enemy's advance and prevented immediate recapture of Guadalcanal. History often records battles in numbers. Men killed, planes lost, territory gained. But on that ridge, victory was measured in survival. Every minute held meant another step toward eventual Allied control. Every life kept alive maintained hope against overwhelming odds. This stand on Guadalcanal shows how history is shaped not by grand gestures, but by ordinary soldiers refusing to break. Their honor lay in persistence under fire, in holding the line when defeat seemed certain. The ridge was lost and won countless times in their minds. Sergeant Henry's squad did not seek glory. Their legacy is a testament to duty and sacrifice. The fight on Guadalcanal turned the tide in the Pacific, because these men held fast when it mattered most.